Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another Archon's Armies with the Eldar Navy. We are continuing our naval series. Sorry it took so long. Let's get right into it. So, what is the Eldar Navy and what do they do? Now, for anyone who hasn't been keeping up with our Eldar series, or rather with our naval series in general, the stats are going to be weird. All of these breakdowns are from a system of my own design called Battlefleet Solar. In some cases, this is a system that's still under overhaul, so there are going to be especially things about the stats that are a little bit abnormal. But believe me, it's still kind of in beta, so we're working on it. But there are two different types of Eldar Navy, so to speak. There is the home Navy and the away Navy, much like the A team and B team for your average sports game. You know, you might have your A squad of football players or soccer players, and then your B squad, your bench sitters, so to speak. The A squad is the home navy. The home navy, usually, depending upon the Eldar involved, is going to involve the craft world, various capital ships, and probably a good bevy of cruisers and escorts, whereas the away group is going to include usually no more than a single capital class vessel, likely 2 or 3 cruisers or light cruisers, and then a smattering of 5 or 6 escorts. The Eldar tend to use a lot of escorts, light cruisers, and cruisers because their number of capital ships is pretty limited, and especially their number of designs is limited. Now, we will be talking about craft worlds in this and where they rank on the firepower and conflict scale, but the stats for them are very prospective. But we'll get to that at the very end. What are the jobs of these navies? Well, the home navy is mainly to protect the biggest asset that the Eldar have. Namely, the home navy protects the craft world itself. So, you would not usually see a single craft world just on its own. Now, it is a very dangerous craft, and it's quite deadly even to other capital class ships, but it isn't the equal of multiple enemy capital class ships. You know, without, if it was a one-on-one, 2 battleships, for example, would probably be able to take out an Eldar craft world on average if it had no support. However, the home navy is entirely based on giving the craft world the support that it needs in order to fight against multiple enemy capital ships. And it has the firepower. The issue is just its durability and the limitations on having one ship that has to serve as both habitation and warship at the same time. But again, we'll get to that when we talk about the craft worlds in general. But that's the home navy. They don't usually get into a lot of scraps unless the craft world is under threat, or unless the craft world is going to war, which can happen on occasion. The Eldar have showed up with their craft world and the home navy and the away navy for a very important thing, say if there was something particularly important on a planet or whatever that they had to take care of, or that they believe they had to take care of. But the home navy's not usually what we're fighting. The away navy is usually what we're fighting. Now, the away navy can vary dramatically, but it usually is roughly the size of a battle fleet, or a subsector battle fleet. So it'll be one capital class ship, either a battle cruiser or kind of the Eldar battleship, but we'll talk about that on the next slide. But they will have one capital ship, one tier 3 weapon ship, that is going to provide the majority of their high firepower, and then they're going to have multiple cruisers supporting it. And then, of course, a standard bevy of escorts. The away navy is meant to achieve assets for the craft world. Now, some craft worlds have multiple away navies, but generally they will have at least one. Which means that the entire home navy plus the entire away navy is like 4 capital ships, up to 8 cruisers, and 16 plus escorts. You know, plus being on the, 16 is on the lower side. So these are large navies, but you don't often see them in these huge numbers. However, you don't usually see individual escorts or squadrons of escorts just going out and raiding like you would with the Dark Eldar. So don't think of the away fleet like you think of the Dark Eldar raiding fleet. Think of the away fleet as a battle fleet that is deployed from the craft world. Think of the craft world as the sector that keeps half the battle fleet with it, and the away fleet is the other half of the battle fleet that it sends out to take care of tactical objectives, things important to the craft world, and then it can also use it to scout out areas ahead of it. For example, if a craft world is going to war, it won't necessarily transport all of its eggs in one basket. It might have the away navy go ahead of it, by a couple of days, a couple of months, so that if anyone has a trap set for them or an ambush, they can prepare and engage with them with the away navy and not risk the craft world. Basically, the entire build of the Eldar, bar any of the little subgroups like the Corsairs, for example, barring them, the whole strategy is built around keeping the craft world safe. Because that is the paramount, that is the penultimate goal. Everything else can be sacrificed in the effort of saving the craft world or keeping the craft world safe. Unique technologies. The Eldar have a lot of these, and a lot of their ship designs are kind of reticent on this unique technology. The first one is the Halo field. Now, unlike the Shimmer and Shadow fields that the Dark Eldar have, which are quite honestly a little bit more powerful, considering that they straight up obfuscate and mimic versions of the ship, the Halo field means that enemies cannot crit outside of positive identification, which is still very, very strong. It means that the Eldar's relatively poor armor isn't as bad in many cases, and they won't just be getting dinged up by tier 2 or tier 1 weaponry all the time, because you can't critically hit to get that increased armor penetration. Now, that does mean that you have to get relatively close to the Eldar ships in order to crit, but it will usually just preclude you from critting altogether at regular combat ranges. Flexible weapons batteries. Again, just like the Dark Eldar, the Eldar build all of their ships to have flexible batteries. So when it says that they have one side weapon or X side weapons, in reality it's a weapon that can basically shoot 270 degrees, or have multiple weapons that can reach out and shoot at 270 degrees to the main axis of the aircraft. So they don't have to worry about one side battery or another side battery, like the Imperials do, being locked off from firing. The next one is the quote-unquote Eldar Wraithbone armor. Now, there's a lot of things to Wraithbone, and there are a couple of ships that are particularly made with a Wraithbone core. In Battlefleet Solar, they have rules that make them heal more, basically, when they use repair crews. So instead of healing 10 resilience, they heal 20. So that's for those specific ships, but in general, the Wraithbone armor basically just means that the Eldar don't have to up-armor any particular portions of their craft. The rear of an Eldar craft, the side of an Eldar craft, and the front of an Eldar craft are all going to have relatively the same protection, even with, different designs. So there is no frontal versus 3/4 armor for Eldar craft like there were for other craft, because they use Wraithbone armor. That doesn't mean that the armor is necessarily all that much thicker or all that much sturdier. Obviously, per the size and weight of the craft, it's going to be different than using steel, obviously. You can look to the averages video if you want to see the difference between them. But yeah, it essentially means that there will only be one number that classifies the armor all over the Eldar vessels. The next one is Eldar anti-aircraft. It's basically the same thing as the Dark Eldar one. It uses a percentage rather than calculating up the numbers for their anti-aircraft effects. Essentially, because the Eldar ships are very much designed to protect themselves from enemy torpedoes, aircraft, etc., they have a very, very good system of anti-aircraft, and often they will be psychically active, and that can also interfere with aircraft and with things like torpedoes targeting them. They also have some scramblers for enemy torpedoes. And the last one is a pretty simple one, and it's consistent among almost all Eldar vessels: solar sails. Now, solar sails are a pretty simple upgrade. They essentially allow the craft world to accelerate while also performing another action. Now, in Battlefleet Solar, you have the option to accelerate your craft or increase its speed by +1, pretty much. Now, Eldar ships are already fast, but using the solar sails, they can speed up by 1 gravity each turn, and then also heal themselves, or also focus their guns, or also do another action on top of that. So solar sails just give them the option to go even faster than they already are, if they want to. And the last one is, where do they come from? Coming out of the webway. Well, there's a lot of Eldar transit through the webway. It's not as easy to move, transit, and shift through as the back doors of Kamara. Now, the webway has its gates, and it can be modified, but the Dark Eldar can just show up anywhere, and they're very, very hard to track and keep track of because their entrances and exits to Kamara are very hidden and very secret. Whereas the Eldar, especially in a lot of cases where they're coming out of or close to a planetoid, their gateways, and especially the webway gates on planets, are very big and very obvious. Now that doesn't mean that you can destroy them or that you can just wait outside of them, because of course the Eldar are able to see outside of them to a certain degree, psychically so to speak. But it does mean that on occasion, Eldar ships can be monitored as they enter and leave the webway. Now, that's not always the case. Of course, there are secret entrances to the webway and back out of it. But in general, a lot of ships like craft worlds and such will spend a lot of their time in real space and then dip into the webway if they particularly need to. At least that's my understanding of it. I'm sure that an Eldar fan will correct me in the comments, which is great because I'm not as well read on Eldar as I should be. So, let's get to the weapons, and this is honestly a really, really cool picture. Shoutouts to my homie on Patreon. Not my actual Patreon. Again, I make no claim to art. But there are 4 weapons that are going to be talked about in this video, on top of launch bays, which are also a very ubiquitous Eldar thing. They are very big on attack craft, much like the Dark Eldar. So, Eldar Pulse Lances are the first one, and these ones honestly remind me a lot of the Covenant plasma weapons, especially the, ventral plasma weapons from the big cruisers. There are multiple types of them. Some of them are much stronger, some of them are much weaker. They're usually limited by how much power the craft has, so obviously Tier 3 Pulse Lances are going to be different from Tier 1 Pulse Lances. And generally they are fixed. So these are not usually something that is flexible. Though theoretically you could have ones that were flex weapons in and of themselves, and then kind of the quote-unquote fixed ones, or the Eldar broadside, because the fixed ones shoot just forward, the flex ones fire 360, and then the side batteries essentially fire 270 degrees. But pulse lances tend to be fixed, unless they are the little small ones that are used for flex. These have less damage, but they change that out for an extra shot and more armor penetration. So, generally pulse lasers or lances are really bad at penetrating shields. And they're particularly bad for frontal and for Imperial ships, because even the biggest Imperial ships only get 4 shots per set of lances, which means that you're only stripping 4 layers of voids per turn. And if you're firing with something like a Grand Cruiser, that means you're knocking out a grand total of 12 voids. That's not even going to strip them off of some escorts. So, they're not very good against shields. What the Eldar do is they drop the overall damage in exchange for a much more focused shot that deals more armor penetration, but they also get to fire twice, essentially, with each of their lances. So, it's a pulse, kind of like a bip-hop, bip-hop, just like a burst shot of laser. In some cases, it's described as hitting multiple times. In some cases, it's described as being like a ray or a spread of laser. But in either case, it just means that they get an extra shot, and it makes their pulse weapons far more efficient at getting rid of shields, because the frontal weapons on something like their battleship, the Void ships, are capable of destroying much more shielding than even Imperial capital ships are. Or, equal for considerably less weight. But they still have good armor penetration, in fact, better than most regular lances. The trade-off is they do less raw damage, so sometimes you can waste a lot of that AP hitting vessels that aren't all that armored. So you're going to lance through most cruisers, you're going to absolutely obliterate the armor on escorts, but in comparison to an Imperial lance, you're going to be doing less damage overall. Eldar torpedoes. So these, they have scramblers for them that cuts enemy AA, like we talked about. But the other one is that certain Eldar vessels have access to vortex warheads. Now again, in Battlefleet Solar, I don't usually include specialty ammunition. However, it does seem to imply that the vortex warheads are somewhat unique or specialized to only a specific handful of Eldar vessels. I'd have to double check that, but if that was the case, I would limit it to those, and then essentially have the torpedoes, instead of doing the regular flat 10 damage that they deal, it would increase it to around 15. So essentially, the ships that rely on these Vortex warheads will do 50% more damage, straight up, not doing torpedoes, for your reference, have a low chance to hit and a high chance to be intercepted, but they deal automatic damage, not having to worry about armor or about anything else. Really, they just go straight through shields and straight through armor and deal flat damage. So these Vortex warheads are going to do even more damage. The next one is Eldar missiles. Now, these are the two different types of weapon batteries. You can have the Eldar missiles, or star cannons, fusion blasters, and graviton pulsars. Now, Eldar missiles are unlike the Dark Eldar counterparts in the fact that they are essentially a massive increase in armor penetration at the exchange of losing a solid portion of their range. One of the big advantages of missiles for the Imperials, and to a degree for missiles for the Dark Eldar, is that they have a lot of range. Now, the Eldar, they keep the armor penetration that the Dark Eldar have, but they lose a lot of range. So it's less shots, but in exchange for that drop of range and also drop of shots, you have much more armor penetration, which even the Dark Eldar missiles are considerably less armor penetrative than the Eldar missiles are. So the Eldar are going to use their missiles much more like a broadside weapon, even though it's that 270-degree broadside, quote-unquote. The last one, star cannons, fusion blasters, and graviton pulsars. These are just the three different types of broadside weapons that fit into weapons batteries on Eldar vessels. Apart from Eldar missiles, which are the other option for that slot, these three, obviously based on size, graviton pulsars, fusion blasters being the smallest, gravitons being tier 2, and then star cannons being tier 3, they're essentially slightly lower damage than macro cannons, with the exchange of having more armor penetration and range. So it's kind of a non-trade-off to a degree between the Eldar missiles and these kind of various cannon options. It's going to be based on whether you want to have more firepower or more damage, and of course whether you're willing to stomach the lack of range. A lot of Eldar vessels have very advanced technology, and that's why something that is effectively just like a very small, heavy weapon, for a ship at any rate. Apart from the star cannons, most of these are relatively analogous to something like super heavy tank weapons, especially the fusion blaster and graviton pulsar. The star cannon is definitely more accurate to a macro cannon or a lance, but in any case, these are all just kind of grouped under alternatives that are similar to macro cannons in terms of how they're employed, but they have more range and more armor penetration because, of course, they are Eldar, and you can see the consistent thing is more armor penetration, more armor penetration, more armor penetration. That's the whole shtick. All of their focus is on penetrating enemy armor, effectively so that they're smaller, less impressive bevy of weapons in some cases, and of course their use of much smaller escorts in large numbers can overcome the armor protection of much larger Imperial vessels, like you can see here. So, let's move on to the first set, our only quote-unquote capital ships of the Eldar roster outside of the craft world. The first one is the only battleship in Eldar service, the Void Stalker. Now, it is a battleship with tier 3 weapons, but it has one of the quicker speeds for a battleship at 4 grav. Now remember, Eldar could also increase that by 1 and take another action. So theoretically, this thing could be outspeeding a vast majority of Imperial cruisers without even trying. It has a resilience of 180. Again, you'll notice a lot of Eldar vessels are very thin, small, spindly. They're not going to have as much resistance, but 180 is on par with an Imperial Grand Cruiser and absolutely nothing to sniff at. The armor for this is also equal to a Grand Cruiser, one of the heaviest armored vessels in the Eldar arsenal at 18. Again, all around because of that Wraithbone protection. They have a void layers of 22. One of the things that you'll often notice with Eldar vessels is because of all their advantages and their high percentage chance to shoot down enemy weaponry, they tend to have less voids than their equivalent Imperial counterparts. Now, the Void Stalker isn't bad, but there are some other much more egregious examples, like the Dragon and Naiad that we're going to talk about in a second. But 22 isn't bad. Flex mountings. One of the big advantages of the Voidstalker is that it can mount lots of flexible weaponry. 5 flex weapons, 2 on either side and 1 on top in the rear. Now this gives it a significant amount of relatively medium to short range firepower, but it also has 2 launch bays. You'll notice that this massive split at the rear and split in the center is effectively 2 dual launch bays. Again, this really relies on aircraft a lot, like a lot of Eldar vessels, but you'll also notice that the main teeth of the Voidstalker are its fixed weapons. With 4 of those pulse weapons, it is essentially toting on the very front of the ship the entire broadside of a Grand Cruiser, effectively. So this thing is a genuine battleship. It will mess up things like Grand Cruisers and Battle Cruisers, but it isn't all that tough, and it isn't as heavily armored as other ships like Battle Cruisers can be. It has a manpower of 14, giving it a relative crew complement of about 14,000, minimum. An Auspex accuracy, or in this case just the Eldar anti-aircraft, of 45%, which, again, considering most ships, it's like sub-30, 45% is an insanely high anti-aircraft amount. So, not only will it have aircraft to boost that, it also is able to shoot torpedoes out of the air almost on a coin flip, which is very, very useful when you're facing, say, multiple enemy cruisers. Now, of course, the big thing for these is that kind of shadow field that they have, and like it says here, any vessel that rolls to crit against the ship uses half of their Auspex for any roll. That's unique to this one, but that is in addition to the fact that they already have that field technology aboard that makes you unable to crit whatsoever until you are positively identified. It's just even harder to crit on the Voidstalker, making that 18 armor not as bad as it could be. Now, prepare your face, enemy capitals. That's the quote that I have for this, and it's pretty much on par. Now, the Voidstalker's really not designed to go side to side with an enemy Grand Cruiser and pump away at it with its weapons. Realistically, because it doesn't have any side batteries whatsoever, it just has launch bays. So what the Voidstalker is going to do is, as it's going to be the only capital in the formation, of the away fleet, it's going to sit in the way, way, way back. It's going to deploy all of its aircraft, and it's going to point its prow towards the enemy capital ship and unleash all 4 of its pulse weapons every turn, burst down your shields, attack you with aircraft, and then if you try and come close, come up to brawl with it, you will face 5 flexible weapons, which are very dangerous to something like an enemy escort that comes within range. And of course, this thing's pure broadside between the launch bays, the pulse lasers, and the flexible weapons could probably obliterate something like a light cruiser in 1 to 2 turns, and could probably cripple a standard cruiser only a turn after that. But of course, it is quite mobile and quite quick in comparison to most other vessels. And it can also turn while running. The next one up is the Phoenix. It's a bit of an odd duck as well. I've classed it as a battlecruiser because that's how they classify it, but it is questionable whether it really deserves the title. It has a weapon tier of 3, another one that is weapon tier 3. With a resilience of 160, we're dropping down from the Voidstalker's 120. Again, it's not a true battleship, it's definitely a battle cruiser. Only a speed of 3, which again, only a speed of 3. Plenty of other ships have slower speeds than 3, battleships and Grand Cruisers included. And remember, of course, you can bump that up by 1 for free because of the solar sails. Armor of 18, again, equal to the Voidstalker. However, here's where you see the first divergences in this battlecruiser. 2 less void layers, 2 less flex mountings, and it substitutes one of the launch bays for a weapons battery. But it retains 2 pulse lasers instead of the 4 for the Voidstalker, and drops down by 5 manpower and by 5 Auspex accuracy percentage. Reliable, compact, ubiquitous, Phoenix. That's pretty much all that I have to say about this thing, because at the end of the day, the Phoenix class is designed to be a relatively consistent, relatively multi-purpose, and honestly, compared to a Voidstalker, cheap alternative. Now, are the Eldar producing hundreds of capital ships? Not really. Not in any numbers appreciable that we would consider them. So the Phoenix is really going to be something that you're going to see a lot with that away fleet. It's going to be the standard capital ship. Voidstalkers are definitely going to be some of the best ships available to the Eldar at any one time. So they're probably going to keep those with the home fleet. because losing them would be very, very dangerous, and also because having them with the home fleet means that if they come across a particular danger, they're in no threat because they have the best possible ship at that place. So the Phoenix is going to be your away guy, and for that reason, it's almost set up like a Luna-class cruiser in terms of versatility. It has its forward-facing, heavy pulse weapons. It has its flex mountings, again, a respectable number, three flex mountings, a launch bay, and a weapons battery. Again, the weapons batteries can either be those missiles, or they can be that various bevy of, in this case, star cannons, but if it was a tier 2, it'd be graviton pulsars. If it was a tier 1, it'd be fusion blasters. So the Phoenix is kind of a middle ground. It's smaller, it's probably more reliable because it's not going to take as much maintenance as the massive Stalker battleship, and it is ubiquitous. This will be something that will be available to most craft worlds. It may be their flagship. It may be the big capital that they have. They may not have a Void Stalker handy, but the Phoenix they will have, 100%. If you attack a craft world and they don't have a Void Stalker, you will be facing at least one Phoenix battlecruiser. So, is it an equal to every single Imperial battlecruiser? Not really. In a 1-to-1 fight, the Phoenix is definitely going to take a chunk out of you, for sure, especially with its launch bays, but it's not as durable, it's not as well armored in some cases, and its armament, especially its frontal armament, can leave a good amount to be desired. But it has very similar firepower, and the Auspex accuracy actually helps it quite a bit, resisting those heavy torpedo attacks that other enemy battlecruisers have available. Next, we get to a couple of weird ones, the Dragon and the Naiad. Now, the Dragon is one of those Eldar Wraithbone constructs that heals better that I was talking about. Its core is Wraithbone. These are tier 3 kind of cruiser plus ships. They're not quite heavy cruisers, but they're also not quite battle cruisers just yet. They're just very heavily armed cruiser chassis. Now, they're armed essentially exactly the same way that the Phoenix is, but they have different stats. They have a higher speed at 4. They have resilience of 150 instead of 160, making them a little bit weaker. The Naiad, by the way, is this kind of Corsair-looking one, and by the way, it is a big Corsair ship. And the Dragon is this one on the bottom with the blue sail. 150 resilience, only 16 armor, again, dropping it below both the Voidstalker and the Phoenix. These are cruisers, after all, but they are very heavy. 14 void layers. That's the first massive difference. That's a drop of 6 from the Phoenix. And the really big thing here is that tier 3 weaponry. That's drawing a lot of power from these vessels, and that limits their void layers quite heavily, which means that they're not going to want to be able to engage with as many targets at the same exact time like these ones would be okay with. So while they have the same service as a capital ship, you should consider them more heavy cruisers or even cruisers plus than considering them true capital ships, and I would very much bulk from the idea of calling them battle cruisers. 2 flex mountings only, again, usually one at the back and one at the middle of the ship, or in the case of the Dragon, it looks like it has 1 on either side or 2 on either side. The side batteries for these are exactly the same as the Phoenix, tier 3 launch bay and a tier 3 weapons battery, and then it usually only has, as you can see, 1 singular pulse laser at the front, and a manpower of 8, much more analogous to a cruiser, with an Auspex accuracy of 35%. Again, not bad, but definitely not the 45% of the Voidstalker or the 40% of the Phoenix. They are capital ships for Corsairs. Essentially, if you're not tied to a craft world, if you're not attached to some other major organization that has managed to hold on to a lot of resources after the fall of the Eldar Empire, the Dragon or the Naiad might be your best option in terms of copping yourself a true capital ship, quote-unquote. So it's kind of like a discount capital ship. Next, we have all of the cruisers and light cruisers. I've paired up a lot of these classes because not only is there very, very, very minor variation between them, the differences between the paired classes makes a lot more sense than anything else. So, the Kurnus and the Vol. The Kurnus and Vol are standard cruisers. They have weapon tier 2, a speed of 4, again, only a little bit faster than the average cruiser, a resilience of 120, which is significantly lower than the average cruiser. These are much smaller, much more bulbous and focused upon their weaponry, and an armor of 16. 16 isn't bad. That's the frontal armor of a cruiser in most cases, meaning that it's going to be out-armoring cruisers on the side. With a void layer of 14, though, it's kind of on par with or worse than some other fellow cruisers. Only 2 flex mountings, but the same arrangement of weaponry as the others, plus 2 torpedo tubes. So 1 launch bay, 1 weapons battery, 2 flex mountings, 2 torpedo tubes. Now, this one is essentially just manpower 6, aspect accuracy 35%. It is up-armed, up-armored for easy matchups. This is designed to go toe-to-toe with an enemy Luna-class cruiser, and on average, the Kuranos and the Vol are going to beat it. Not only is it due to the fact that it has significantly better armor if the enemy gets close, but it also has torpedo tubes for guaranteed damage, launch bays for guaranteed damage, weapons batteries and flex mountings to deal with enemy cruisers that don't have flex mountings but do have more weapons batteries. So the idea is that the Kuranos will essentially run the enemy cruiser for a very nasty chase, as it is faster than it by 2 grav. It can outpace them, outmatch them, outturn them, have all of its firepower on target for longer, and of course it can always run away using its launch bays and torpedo tubes to knock out the enemy cruiser. For this reason, it is kind of the cruiser beater, and especially the light cruiser beater, of the Eldar arsenal, and it is a very all-around vessel, not really being specialized in anything. It doesn't have overwhelming firepower, it doesn't have overwhelming aircraft, it doesn't have overwhelming frontal weaponry. It's just fairly average. Definitely like a mid-size sedan of cruisers. The Shadow and the Eclipse are basically anything but average. They are a cruiser of weapon tier 2, but a speed of 6 grav. This is a cruiser going bare minimum twice as fast as the average Imperial cruiser. It is absolutely zoomin'. A resilience of 100, however, is inferior to the Vol, and its armor is also inferior at 14. However, it has more void layers. Essentially, it relies on its voids much more, thus it has 2 more. However, its weaponry is significantly lighter, with only 1 flexible mounting, 2 torpedo tubes, and 1 launch bay. This has no weapons batteries, essentially shortening the extended hull of the Kuranos in exchange for more speed, more void layers. And with those 2 torpedo tubes and the launch bays, you can pretty much see exactly what the Shadow and the Eclipse are doing. They are intending, very, very intentionally, to go around and run around enemy ships that are trying to chase them, constantly outmaneuvering them, and going so quick and so far away that by the time that they're out of aircraft for their launch batteries, the enemy have basically been crippled, and they can come around and use their torpedoes and their flex mountings to knock them out. And it's just 30% aux accuracy because, of course, it is putting most of its energy towards its speed. And it's just everything is sacrificed to give the Shadow and the Eclipse class maximum speed for a cruiser. This is one of the fastest cruisers in basically the entire setting, barring a couple of very specific ones. But they're absolutely booking it at the speed of a escort, basically. The Wraith is the next one, another Wraithbone-style ship that's going to have that increased healing factor. Again, Tier 2, it is a light cruiser, but it has an incredible speed of 7 grav, basically allowing it to transit the entire board in like 3 turns, if it gives itself some extra speed. But you'll notice a resilience of only 80. That's a drop of 40 from the average cruiser, and it's a drop of even more than that than some other heavy cruisers. Now, this thing is not very well armed or armored, and its void layers are pitiful, only 10. That's on par with most Imperial naval merchantmen or escorts. Armor of 14 isn't bad, but it's not great for a light cruiser, especially without that prow armor. It's definitely going to be taking hits from a lot of Tier 1 weaponry, especially lances, and getting knocked out, or at least taking significant damage. However, the big advantage here is really the firepower options that you have on the Wraith. The Wraith has 1 flex mounting, usually in the center. It has 1 weapons battery, usually on the sides. And then it has a fixed option of batteries. It can either take 1 pulsar lance, and then, it always takes 1 pulsar lance, and then you can choose 4 torpedo tubes or a forward launch bay. So you can kind of see that this is the quintessential light cruiser. It's quick, it's chewy between its increased healing and its 80 resilience, and it's a generalist Plus, it has that Wraithbone construction that allows it to heal itself much more quickly. So, the Wraith has a lot of advantages, especially with the options of its fixed batteries, but between its low armor, low voids, and relatively poor manpower and auspex accuracy, you can see how this is definitely light cruiser material as opposed to cruiser material, because at the end of the day, it really is small and compact, and it's pretty heavily reliant on its, Wraithbone durability and on its frontal weaponry to take care of enemies. So, as you can you're starting to get the idea, a lot of Eldar ships don't want to engage in line of battle style engagements with the enemy, both because they want to preserve their lives as much as possible and protect assets via, skirmish and attrition rather than outright battle, but you can also see how if they were drawn into outright battle, something like the Wraith would suffer heavily. The Aurora is the next light cruiser type, again a tier 2 weaponry, but with a speed of 8 grav, even quicker than the Wraith, absolutely booking it all across the board at high speed. But it pays for it. 70 resilience and 12 armor. That is terrible. Even for an escort, only 12 armor is not good whatsoever. And 70 resilience is worse than most other light cruisers and only better than a very, very small few. 16 void layers, however, which means that it can rely on it much more than the Wraith can. But what is it trading all of those disadvantages for? Well, the main thing that it's trading it for is not the flex mounting, it's the launch bays, the 4 torpedoes, and the 2 pulse lances. So this is very heavily frontally armed. 4 torpedo tubes and 2 pulse lances means that it is even better frontally armed than the Wraith, which is what it really does when it comes to having more support for its own, designs. Its speed, its hit and run tactics, it relies on its frontal weapons to do that. Manpower of 6, like the Wraith and the Kuranos, honestly, not too abnormal. The big advantage with it is that it has 4 more auspex accuracy than the Wraith, giving it a much higher chance of ignoring enemy hits, but still not a great chance. It's definitely not a cruiser. And I describe it as I'm really more of a big destroyer. I'm good for escorting allies and scouting or harassing enemies. The Aurora definitely is not like a line of battle ship. It has multiple kind of far range direct damage options between the launch bays, the torpedo tubes, and the pulsar lances. It really doesn't have any line weaponry, unlike the Wraith, which at least has a weapons battery. The Aurora relies almost entirely on automatic indirect damage. So, onto our escorts here, and we've got some silly looking ones. I'm sorry. Eldar ships have always looked, especially the old ones, have always looked kind of like, oh, that's kind of funny. It looks like a bird. And I know that's very aesthetic for some people, but for me, this looks absolutely hilarious. So, let's get on to these trio of vessels. I don't usually put 3 vessels together, so let me explain why this is. These are all frigates, and they all do exactly one thing. The Hellbore and the Hemlock are very, very similar, as is the Shadowhunter, but the Shadowhunter is a little bit different. They all have 8 grav in speed, incredibly quick, 40 resilience, which isn't bad. It's pretty on par for a frigate, honestly. 12 armor, again, not good. That's definitely not good for an escort. 14 void layers, which again, not bad. That's pretty good. That's better than some of the light cruisers because they're only using tier 1 weaponry and only one weapon in many cases. Now, what they do have is one of those weapons batteries, again, much more of a low damage, high AP option. But the big advantages of the Hemlock, Hellbore, and Shadowhunter is their frontal armament. They have 2 torpedoes and a pulsar lance, usually each. There are variants that have different things. For example, I describe them, and they have 3 manpower and 24 auspex accuracy. I describe them as follows. The Hellbore is up here. It's a sniper, but it's still a pretty standard escort. You can see where it's equipped with the pulsar lance, the torpedo tubes underneath the hull, and then it's 1 weapons battery up top. That is the weapons battery that kind of looks like the regular flex, but it's a weapons battery in a tier 1 ship, or in an escort ship. That's the sniper. Fairly standard, fairly usual for an escort, definitely on par with most Imperial frigates in everything outside of its protection. Then we get to the Hemlock. The Hemlock cuts off the front part of the ship and basically exchanges that weapons battery for a larger pulsar lance. It's essentially going to be slightly smaller. Stats are going to be a little bit different, but not massively. It will probably not have the weapons battery. It may have one flex weapon instead of the weapons battery. But again, I haven't differentiated them because they are very, very similar, relying heavily on that frontal pulsar lance. So it's more of a scout sniper. It's more of a scout sniper, the Hemlock. The other one, the last one, is the heavy sniper. Now, the Shadow Hunter, sorry, I mixed them up. The Shadow Hunter is the one that's a scout sniper. It's very fast, very mobile, has only the pulsar lance and then like maybe a flex weapon. The Hemlock is the one that does away with most of the firepower in exchange for having a much stronger frontal lance. This might be one where it gives up all of the other weaponry and gets a tier 2 weapon instead, kind of like a tank destroyer. It's that heavy sniper escort that could be used against, say, an enemy cruiser or an enemy light cruiser and do a lot of damage to them if their shields were knocked out. So again, just to go through it again, the Hellbore is that kind of mid-range sniper, much more like a standard escort. The Shadow Hunter is a scout sniper, very low energy capacity, very low firepower, but it just has that single pulsar lance and maybe some torpedoes. And the heavy sniper, the Hemlock, probably trades most of its firepower, except for maybe a flex weapon, in exchange for a higher tier fixed pulse lance. So you can kind of think of them as the sniper is the Hellbore, the scout sniper is the Shadow Hunter, and then the heavy sniper is the Hemlock, which is very on par. I don't know why they keep naming them after poisonous plants, but I guess that's cool. Speaking of which, Nightshade. Nightshade is a pretty classic destroyer, honestly, other than a couple of specific things. You'll notice again, 8 grav in speed, a resilience of 25, very, very low, for a reason. Armor of 10, void layers of 10, absolutely abysmal. That's terrible protection in every single ship in the entire system. That's just bad. There are some merchantmen that have better protection than that. No flex mountings. But what do we have here? A weapons battery of tier 1 and 4 torpedo tubes. So this is the one that is, 2 manpower, 30% allspice accuracy. It's an Eldar Cobra with the advantage of using Eldar weaponry. Now, the Cobra class and the Widowmaker, by extension of it, essentially rely 100% on their torpedoes to kill things. The Nightshade has that, plus it's one of the ones that uses vortex torpedoes, and it has a weapons battery on top of that kind of frontal nose cone of fire that can help it out with dealing with other escorts. Now, do I think that the Nightshade is capable of downing light cruisers on its own? Absolutely freaking not. It does not have the health for it, nor does it have the actual protection. But what the Nightshade would be good at doing is essentially exactly what the Cobra does. It goes around with several other Nightshade escorts or destroyers, and it launches bevies of 12 torpedoes at an enemy. Each of those torpedoes has a, let's say, 10% or 15% chance to just deal flat 15 damage to an enemy. If that's an enemy escort and you hit 3 times, you've just crippled them in a single turn, using all of your escorts, but still crippling them. And if it's much larger ships, you're going to be doing massive chip damage to a vessel that you couldn't otherwise penetrate the armor of. Moving on to the Aconite, or the Acronite, or whatever this is. It is a frigate. Again, pretty standard design, like the Nightshade, just a little bit more compact. Speed of 9 grav. Insane speed. This thing is one of the quickest vessels in the entire system. It is on par with the fast Clipper ship, yet it is stronger with 40 resilience, more protected with 12 armor, 14 void layers, no flex mountings and no fixed batteries, but 1 weapons battery. So it's like the Nightshade if you doubled the health, took away all of the weapons except for the weapon battery, gave it an extra gravity in speed and an extra manpower, and then dropped the auspex accuracy. This is entirely a scout ship. Much like an armed clipper, you would kind of see this as a a skirmisher incomplete. A skirmisher whose sole job it is to outrun enemy escorts while its cruisers outrun enemy cruisers. All the Aconite really has to do is zoom and boom past an enemy ship, go right past it, fire its shots off, and then come around for another pass and hope that the enemy ship doesn't have any lances. But even if it does, 14 void layers and 40 resilience actually makes this thing relatively tough. So while it's definitely under-armored, the fact that it is so fast and has some decent protection, again, for an Eldar escort, gives it pretty good stats overall, and it lets it make use of that maximum speed. The Solaris is the last one on our list, and it is one of those light cruisers. Now, it is really most analogous to something like a large escort carrier. It has a weapon tier of 2, again, 2 launch bays and flex mounting is really its only armament, with 70 resilience, armor, and the same amount of void layers as the Aurora, 16. So this is essentially an Aurora, except you have taken away one of the, you've taken away the frontal fixed batteries, and you have merely added on 2 launch bays, essentially. So it makes up the action or the format of an escort carrier, and I've made a little bit of a typo there, sorry about that. But yeah, effectively this is a fleet carrier. It's a light cruiser that acts as the equivalent firepower to something like a Shadow or an Eclipse or a Kurnos or a Vol. But it is a light cruiser, much less durable, much faster though, and quite reliable in everything except for its rather abysmal Auspex accuracy, because it is requiring a lot of power to power the literally like 3 launch bays that it has. So, let's get on to our last vessel, and we're going back up to the big boys here. I love this image because it's got the human fleet, the absolute size of this, a literal cruiser coming through a portal. This is just massive, and I really love these Eldar Craft World art pieces. I have one as the thumbnail for this video that I found, and I absolutely adore it. So, where do they fit into this? Well, they are the central flagship for the home fleet, and they're all different. And that's why I don't feel comfortable giving a certain, I don't feel comfortable giving Sam Hain's Craft World statistics, or Eandon. I don't have the Eandon Craft World. I can't give it that statistics. But here's what I would theorize or suggest for if you were to make stats for a Craft World. Name, Craft World, classification, super heavy flying fortress. Now you have to remember, this is as much flying city as it is capital ship. You gotta remember, the heart of this, the core of the Craft World, is keeping the Eldar aboard, civilian and military alike, alive, comfortable, and happy. And safe, of course. So, it is a mix between, Ramilli's class Star Fortress, a purely military thing, and a civilian ship, essentially. Civilian life ship, like a Universe class mass conveyor. Similar to that. Tier weapon is 3, obviously. Only 1 grav in speed. These things are massive. You cannot expect them to go any faster than 2 grav. And of course, because it has solar sails, it can go 2 grav while also doing other actions like healing itself. And a Craft World will also likely be one of those things that is made of Wraithbone and can heal itself much more easily. But a speed of 1 grav puts it slower than most battleships in general. A resilience of 200. Pretty dramatic to have a 200 resilience, but this ship really warrants it. They are enormous. They dwarf many genuine battleships, though it's questionable whether they outclass something like a Gloriana class battleship. In 1-to-1 combat, I think that the Gloriana would probably be able to cripple or drive it off. But if it came down to a fleet engagement, I think that they would both have a much easier time calling each other even. Its armor is only 18. Again, I don't think that Eldar Wraithbone can really be made thick enough or in large enough quantities to get above 18 armor, but it is all around 18 armor, whether you're hitting the deck, whether you're hitting the front, whether you're hitting anything protruding from it. 18 armor, equivalent to every single Grand Cruiser in the game. And with that massive stack of hit points and the increased ability to heal itself, the Craft World is much more durable than it seems, especially because of our next statistic, 30 layers of Void Shields. 30 layers, that is almost the most of any vessel in the entire list. It is massively well powered because a lot of the energy of the craft world isn't going to its engines, rather it's going to other systems, including life support systems. It can drag or draw from those systems to give itself disgustingly thick void shields, giving it a lot of time to fire out at enemy ships because it can simply shrug off or ignore a lot of their firepower using its, 10 extra voids on top of what a normal battleship is going to get. Massive resistance, giving it another turn, basically, to fire at enemy ships. 5 flex mountings, much on par with the battleships. Again, they're going to be spread around the quote-unquote like top or flight deck of the vessel. 2 side batteries. These are going to be weapons batteries for the most part, though I also think that instead of weapons batteries, or in addition to weapons batteries, however, you would have 2 sets minimum of launch bays. So I didn't include it here, but you would have 2 weapons batteries on each side and then 2 launch bays on each side. So 4 launch bays and, the standard 2 WEP batteries on each side. This makes it on par with most battleships and actually kind of outguns a couple of Grand Cruisers, especially with the 5 flex mountings, but that's even before we get to the fixed batteries. And of course, like the Ramillies, these might be set up in different directions, so it's not just fixed in one direction, it might be firing in different directions. Now that's 4 torpedoes and 2 pulse lances. Again, that could be per side, that could be only one direction, that could be both sides, it could be in the rear if you wanted, depending on what the craft world is. But in general, that gives it insane firepower in that single direction, which is pretty good because it doesn't have to rely on something like an armored prow, so not only can it move a lot and transfer its direction a lot using its solar sail, it has the effective ability to overcome a majority of cruiser-class enemies with its torpedoes, pulse lances, and flex mountings alone, which is kind of a requirement for these super heavy ships, is that they're able to outgun a cruiser or a light cruiser with just their secondary armament, not relying on the weapons batteries or the launch bays whatsoever, because it's going to want to save and use those for enemy capital ships, not for cruisers. However, the big difference here with craft worlds is that they will have a disgustingly high manpower. 25 manpower. 25,000 Eldar Guardians, whether they're Eldar Guardians, Craft World Guardians, or Aspect Warriors is up to you. What percentage of those is Aspect Warriors, I'm not entirely sure. It, again, varies based on the Craft World. So, that massive manpower, a lot of it comes from the fact that there are, Eldari civilians aboard who will need protecting, and as a result, there will also be lots of Guardians. But it also comes from the fact that, invasion forces will often be stationed on craft worlds. Not necessarily directly before they're about to invade somewhere. They're usually transferred to a smaller, lighter ship so that they can go in a little bit easier than having a whole craft world enter low orbit. But it does mean that if they go to war, they probably won't be staging themselves on some random cruiser, they'll be staging themselves on the craft world. And it also means that it's really hard to break into and invade an Eldar craft world. God forbid this happens, but something like a Teleportarum strike, the Eldar will send, literal human waves of aspect warriors and guardians to deal with you if you try and teleport like a couple squads of Terminators onto it. Now, it has happened before, and sometimes it's been very successful. However, no offense to any Ultramarine or, Imperial Fist players, I don't think you should ever survive teleporting onto a craft world. I think Chaos is more successful at it because, we directly go against what the Eldar stand for, but considering that we don't like to get along or attack the Eldar in many cases anyway, we don't have as many examples of us coming off with some insane wins against a craft world like the Imperials do. And then finally, an Auspex accuracy of 50%. Basically means that with the off 10% chance that you have of actually hitting a craft world with an automatic damage weapon like aircraft or torpedoes, there is a coin flip chance that your tiny percentage to hit weapon didn't even do anything. Which means, again, every time that there's an automatic damage option for the craft world, it can just flip a coin. Heads, it did nothing. Tails, I take a little bit of damage and I heal it up right after. I love these things. They're incredibly beautiful. Honestly, the artwork for these is so great, and I'm sad there isn't more of it. The 2 that I found were the ones that I personally like. So definitely, share some more of that stuff. But yeah, that's where they fit in. That is the end of this video. we have more Xenos Navy stuff coming up, but I also have some other videos in the pipeline, things like Abhumans. Of course, we are nearing our 500 subscriber mark, which is very wonderful. I have lots of good stuff planned for that. I've been hearing back from lots of my artists. I've got a whole art gallery to show you guys. It's going to be a long stream, and then I'm going to break it up into videos, and then I'm going to finish off the last of what I promised that I would do, and then we're going to go into a new series for the channel, where we start going into chaos, chaos, chaos. We focus on things like the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, Blood Pact, Corrupt Contenders, all of that more chaos stuff. Now, of course, there will be things sprinkled in throughout that, more things that I didn't get to in other series, things that people ask for. And here's the thing. Between or as an addition to those videos, I will be doing more streams. I will be picking out more time to get you guys individualized content. But the really important thing is that you guys need to vote. You need to get friends on here. You need to have them subscribe to us. And of course, the Discord is always open. And you can reach me directly through there. My socials are the same as my YouTube. But beyond that, beyond the unfortunate shilling that I have to do, because I want to get us to the point where we can all have a much larger community and have more force behind us, I wish you all a lovely good night.